So I figured since most of you would not be able to make it to my Comic-Con presentation, I would record a copy here for posterity and for your benefit. So this whole project really began years ago in 2009. I guess I was stumbling through a project involving Justin Green's Pinky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary, which came out in 1972. And though I was focused on the non-autobiographical elements of the book, every article I read couldn't help but mention that Justin Green's seminal work is the first autobiographical comic. And I wrinkle every time I hear something labeled a first. To me, that means there's something earlier that's being overlooked or forgotten, and I want to know what that is. So I kept digging for the elements I was actually interested in, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, is that true? So ultimately, I presented that Pinky Brown paper here at CAC in 2013, and then I promptly dug into trying to find an answer to my unresolved question. I think it's safe to say that most artists include bits and pieces of themselves in everything they do, overtly or otherwise, but I was looking for something that would be similarly revealing as Justin Green's Pinky Brown was in 1972, which was deeply personal and almost embarrassingly revealing. Every example I found about autobiographical comics pushed me further back. There's The Cruel Tale of the Cartoonist, 1961, the Four Immigrants manga, Echoes of the Week, Cartoonist Confessional, and many of them were in languages I didn't understand or was able to read. None of them, though, were autobiographically revealing in the way that Justin Green's work was. And again, if you haven't read his work, then very briefly, he writes about OCD and masturbation. It occurred to me at one point that if I was looking for a confessional type of comic, something that would be deeply personal and revealing, then maybe I should look for coming out stories, which brought me to The Advocate. I knew The Advocate regularly featured work from LGBTQIA+ cartoonists like Joe Johnson and Alison Bechdel, among many others. And the years on this slide are just the years that they had comics actually in the magazine. I learned in the process more about Howard Cruz and his involvement with the comic. Robert Triptow I ended up connecting with, and learned that he worked as a secretary and assistant at The Advocate. But together they went on to co-edit gay comics and be more involved that way than they really had work published in the paper. In typical Michael MacBride fashion, I kept going further and further back until I found the first Advocate issue, which you see here, and it exclusively featured the work of somebody I'd never heard of before, Sam Winston. This was the first comic I saw. I was intrigued, but I couldn't really find anything about him. Part of the problem was cracking the code of what his real name was. It was extremely common for the Advocate staff and contributors to use pseudonyms due to the harassment and targeting that occurred. Even the most commonly associated names with the magazine, Dick Michaels and Bill Rand, were really named Richard Mitch and Bill Rao. Those are photos from the One archives. Sadly, I was unable to find any images of Sam from that time. Pseudonyms were essential to avoid retribution from law enforcement and the public, particularly in the wake of raids at Cooper Donuts, Compton's Cafeteria, the Yukon Bar, New Faces, Black Cat, so on. A few times I could find an interview or an article talking about Sam, and these are contemporary modern articles. They always said one of two things. Either Michaels and Rand worked together with artist and illustrator Sam Winston to overhaul the magazine and transform it into a magazine format, or Sam was a talented artist and cartoonist with an offbeat sense of humor. He knew graphics and could operate a printing press, and yet, as you see on the screen, Sam kept appearing in credits for comics, articles, recipes, film critiques, poems, and was consistently listed as art and production and a contributor to the magazine. He kept being referenced in articles and activities, and letters to the editor referred back to pieces Sam had written, including pieces using the name Samantha Jane. I read through the first 5 years of The Advocate and realized the more popular the magazine became, the smaller Sam's involvement became. In fact, by 1969, he was no longer contributing at all. My interlibrary loan people started to hate me, and I kept running into dead ends, so I decided to visit the One archives at USC. apparently, when the magazine was sold in 1974 to David B. Goodstein, the new owner threw all original documents from the early years away. Thankfully, somebody saved those documents and donated them to what would become the One Archives. Otherwise, all of that would have been lost. In those archives were the original Pride documents. This is the newsletter you see here. So Pride was an organization, and their newsletter featured really the very beginnings of what would become the Advocate magazine. Between those and the letters between the staff from the Advocate, because they had all the internal letters and memorandum and that kind of thing going back and forth that I was able to read through, I was able to learn that Sam was really named John Sam Allen. And the more I read, the more I learned he wasn't just an also-ran or, this buddy that they worked with. He was, in fact, the vice president of Pride. He was the person who actually bought the magazine or the newspaper from Pride for $1. He came up with the name The Advocate, technically Los Angeles Advocate, because he never thought it would outgrow their small community. He created the layout and design for the magazine. He created all the illustrations and art within it. He created and ran the wildly popular Groovy Guy contest. He contributed periodically with political articles, and he also wrote a reoccurring column called The Bead Reader. Really and truly, Sam was the architect of the Advocate's transformation and established the model the future of the magazine would use. Furthermore, the leadership of the Advocate, when it was mentioned in those papers from the 60s, Sam was always listed first, then Dick, then Bill, which is just not the way modern history remembers them. Over the course of my way working through the Pride documents, I saw John Allen transition to Sam Allen, and then ultimately to Sam Winston, where it remained for the duration of the time with the Advocate. With his full name, though, I was able to go back and learn that he was born in August 29th, 1942, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Prior to moving to California, he lived most of his life in Whitefish Bay, where he graduated from high school in 1960. This is his high school yearbook photo. He mentions at different times attending a state college, but doesn't specify where or when. And unfortunately, I don't know and couldn't find what took him from Wisconsin to California. It's possible college took him there, or a job, or maybe he just wanted a fresh start. But once he was there, he found his way to ABC Studios, where he worked with Aristide Laurent to write scripts for General Hospital. They were called in after the first couple seasons tanked, and episodes were only 30 minutes long. It's hard to know exactly when he started working there, but definitively by 1965, he's referencing his time there at the office, and likely worked there through 1968. Working at ABC gave them access to a printing press, which is where, after hours, Sam ran off copies of the first year of The Advocate. And to be clear, the first issue was September 1967, so it was only 4 months of issues being run off in the basement, but they did run off hundreds and hundreds of copies. By December 1968, Sam's final original comic comes into the magazine. So ultimately, he produces 19 comics, and I'm going to flip through them fairly quickly here, but you can obviously download this or look at it later. So this October 1967 comic ends up rerunning, and you'll see it again here in a little bit, but that one was pretty popular and obviously still very relevant. And I believe the May 1969 reprint of that October one is also kind of a saying goodbye to Sam. That was also the last time Sam's Bead Reader column ran. There's one final comic that never saw the light of day, but in the archives I was able to find this this comic kind of in draft form, I guess. He continued writing that Bead Reader until May 1969, but by that time he had sold his portion to Dick and Bill. I couldn't find out for how much he actually sold his shares in the magazine for, but the last time that Sam then is mentioned is that Advocate May 1st, 1969 issue. By then, he had moved to San Francisco, reinvented himself as an English teacher at University Mound. And University Mound was the school associated with the residential home run by the nuns of the Convent of the Good Shepherd. They helped and focused on girls that had either run away from home or struggled at home. Sam, then Mr. Allen, taught English, and I was lucky enough to connect with one of his former students, Darlena, who described Sam as being very pale, blonde hair, wearing white shirts, being very kind and soft-spoken. And she remembered him for a number of reasons, one of which is that the nuns had to come and announce that Sam had passed, and I'll get to that. Because unfortunately, December 15th, 1970, he dies by suicide. While other artists would become more famous and iconic with the relationship to the Advocate, like Joe Johnson and Alison Bechdel, as previously mentioned, Sam established the foundation for them to build upon. His comics were single panel, tackled political issues that continue to resonate today, and became one of the most popular features of the newspaper or magazine. The comics poked fun and provoked laughter and reflection. In short, they were as effective as the Advocate's longer, overtly political articles, and like New Yorker comics, which they resemble, the comics were cut out and shared. He really was the foundation for those who came after him. Beyond the comics, his two biggest contributions to the magazine were the Groovy Guy contest and the Bead Reader. And if you don't know what the Groovy Guy contest was, well, in short, it was part marketing campaign, part excuse to see scantily clad men. Sam connected with many of the local bars in the area, drew people from the modeling agencies, and even found a sponsor to give away a color TV. The first of these contests was in 1968, and it had 7 contestants and 150 people in the audience. By 1969, there were 18 contestants and 700 people in the audience. And it just keeps growing from there. By 1971, there were Groovy Guy contests springing up around the United States, though the LA event was always the largest. And in 1980, it changed from Groovy Guy to Superman, and then the last contest, I think, were held in 1991. As far as the Bead Reader was a reoccurring column in the paper that was straight from Sam's mouth. To read someone's beads, he meant to be honest and direct without any kind of filter. They were often responsive to something going on in the community, but also often and frequently autobiographical and reflective. For instance, this longer one, which I've taken excerpts out of here, addresses his parents' struggles with his homosexuality and coming out to them. I definitely wish I could have learned about Sam sooner, because then I might have had a better chance to meet with or talk to some of the people who knew him directly, like Aristide Laurent or John Kepner or Stuart Timmons, and others that might have shed light on Sam's life and contributions. But unfortunately, I started too late. I learned about him too late, and people passed throughout the steps of my research. It was like I would discover somebody and then they would have passed the previous year. I was, however, able to connect with a lot of artists who are very gracious with their time. Howard Cruz, Robert Tripto, Andy Mengels, Justin Hall, Mark Thompson, Fayette Hauser, Roberta Gregory, Trina Robbins, Karen Green, Cleve Jones, David Talbot, and many others. Sadly, none of them were aware of Sam's work. Sam aside, there are also a number of other artists that I came across in the archives that really deserve more attention. I had a connection with the previous iteration of the Advocate to make a book documenting them and their work, kind of like a coffee table book with bios and that kind of thing. But the ownership there has changed a number of times, and it's hard to know if that's going forward, but I'm still pursuing it. But I would put this call out there that there are plenty of artists that have either short runs or even just one-off comics in the early years. And you can see those on the screen here. And finally, I'll just end with thank yous to people like Chris Field, who friend and colleague, and always commiserated with me and helped me come up with ideas, and just, periodically ask how it was going, which was always kind of inspiring to keep chugging along. Obviously, the One Archives for sharing their rich archive of material and helping me find all the things I wanted. Chasing chasing down things after I was back across the country. Justin Green, who unintentionally was the spark for this presentation and project, but who was also very gracious with connecting me to people he knew in the area, as he lived in San Francisco at the time as well, and was always very patient and responsive to my numerous questions. The librarians at the Scott County Library in Shakopee for accommodating all my various requests, people at Marquette University Special Collections, and so on. There are so many people who helped make these projects happen, and I just wanted to give them all a quick thank you. But thank you so much.